Beneath the chandeliers of Windsor, a select few gathered. But it wasn't the occasion that stunned insiders. It was what they wore. Jewels thought to be sealed away forever emerged on royal necks and wrists. Why that night? And why those pieces? What followed wasn't celebration. It was silence, conflict, and coded defiance. It began as a seemingly private dinner, a closed-door affair described only as a family unity evening by the palace's terse official note. No cameras, no press, no public invitations. Yet behind those ancient walls, a storm was about to break. One not of words, but of symbolism, of inheritance, of power. Those who arrived early barely recognized the women who walked in behind them. It wasn't their dresses nor their titles. It was the unmistakable shimmer of history that clung to their throats and ears. Tiaras unseen since coronation processions. Brooches that hadn't graced public photographs in over half a century. Bracelets once whispered to have been locked away for emotional reasons. That night, they weren't just worn. They were declared. Royal staff noticed it instantly, even if they dared not comment aloud. The vault registry, a sealed internal document listing the most guarded treasures of the monarchy, hadn't shown any recent sign-outs for the pieces now paraded under crystal chandeliers. And yet, there they were, glittering like ghosts resurrected. Not loaned, not gifted. Claimed. Whispers began before the soup was served. Some said there had been a private meeting that afternoon, held not in the drawing rooms, but in the lower corridors, near the vaults. A select trio had allegedly descended into the depths, emerging hours later with sealed velvet cases. No attendance, no documentation, just silence, and a growing sense of calculated rebellion. By the time Queen Camilla entered, the atmosphere had turned electric. But it wasn't just her presence that drew eyes. It was her necklace. A piece last associated with the abdication crisis. A symbol of royal shame and private defiance. A jewel many thought permanently shelved, too controversial to ever surface again. She wore it like a battle cry, daring anyone in the room to question its return. Charles, seated just a few feet away, avoided her gaze. Catherine remained composed, but her hand visibly tightened around her glass. Princess Anne, ever the sentinel, watched without blinking. The tension wasn't whispered. It was worn. Every jewel told a story, and every story was a weapon. Behind the scenes, 2 legal advisors were present, an unusual detail for such a supposedly informal event. Not seated, not mingling, observing. Their presence wasn't explained, but it didn't need to be. Something had shifted. Protocols had been bypassed, traditions quietly shattered, and no one dared speak of it aloud. Because this wasn't about fashion. It was about legacy, about silent wars long left unresolved, suddenly flaring to life in diamonds and sapphires. This wasn't a dinner. It was a declaration, a reckoning, a message wrapped in silk and history. The past had returned, and it demanded to be seen. But the jewels themselves weren't the message. Their origins were, and tracing them leads to a story buried decades ago. Long before that night, lines had been drawn, in ink, in blood, and in silence. The Queen Mother's will had locked more than assets. It had trapped resentments. Some pieces were meant for one duchess, but ended up on another's neck. Tonight's jewels exposed unresolved battles that even Charles couldn't contain. The monarchy has never been just about duty or devotion. It has always been about possession. Possession of titles, of territory, of legacy. And when it came to the family's most intimate treasures, their jewels, the fight was never public, but it was always personal. The Queen Mother, in her final days, was said to have rewritten her will 3 times. Each revision bore consequences no solicitor could mend. In a family where silence was tradition, she left behind a storm disguised in velvet boxes. She had divided the jewels not by love or logic, but by instinct. And in doing so, she left behind not peace, but power imbalances. Whispers had long suggested that Catherine, then still Duchess of Cambridge, had been promised a specific sapphire suite, one deeply tied to Diana's memory, one believed to have been reserved with William's future in mind. But after the Queen Mother's passing, that suite quietly vanished from her name. It reappeared months later, inexplicably, in Camilla's possession. No explanation was offered, no apology given. The only certainty? Catherine never wore it. Not once. Not even in private. The Duchess of Edinburgh, too, bore her own quiet bitterness. A tiara she had reportedly selected with the Queen's blessing, a design she had tailored her wedding look around, was reassigned days before her ceremony. Reassigned without warning, without notice, and without the courtesy of a replacement. It was said that she accepted it with a smile. But she never forgot. Nor did she forgive. Her appearance at the Windsor gathering, bareheaded among a sea of diamonds, was a message few caught, but all insiders understood. And then there was Princess Anne, the one who didn't care for public approval, who refused to perform grief or joy on command. But when it came to the vaults, she held the past in her hands. She had watched her mother, Queen Elizabeth II, override the Queen Mother's designations in the final years of her reign, moving items, reassigning pieces, modernizing the heirloom lists to accommodate shifting family roles. But Anne did not forget the original ledger. She had seen the names written by her grandmother, and she did not recognize the edits. When asked to accept the revised designations, Anne reportedly replied with just one word: no. In the days leading up to the Windsor event, several vault records were amended. Last-minute reallocations signed under Queen Elizabeth II's archived authority were reissued under Charles's reign. But the signatures, some say, bore Camilla's touch. It was rumored she had persuaded the king to correct historical oversights, reinstating herself as a rightful recipient of several high-value pieces. But whether it was correction or conquest remained the subject of hushed debates across the palace corridors. And yet, one woman never fought. She waited. And what she wore that night revealed a far more dangerous truth. Catherine, Princess of Wales, didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her choice of jewels was surgical, a message not for the cameras, but for the family. The tiara she wore hadn't been seen in public since Diana's final official portrait, and its reappearance was no accident. There was no announcement, no palace statement, no explanation offered. But those who understood the language of legacy knew exactly what had been said the moment Catherine stepped into the room. Around her neck sat the deep blue sapphire choker, an unmistakable signature from Diana's most private collection. Not crown property, not listed in public archives. It was a piece Diana had once insisted would only be worn by someone who truly understood the price of silence inside the monarchy. And now, decades later, it had returned, not on a queen, but on a woman who had watched quietly as her own place was challenged, eroded, and redefined. Whispers of how Catherine came into possession of the choker spread fast. Insiders pointed to an unscheduled visit made by Prince William to the lower vaults just weeks before the Windsor gathering. Officially, he had been inspecting a family archive. Unofficially, it was rumored he had bypassed standard protocols, accessing a section reserved for Diana's sealed personal estate. No aides present, no paper trail, just a prince reclaiming something that was never supposed to be touched. And if that story was true, it explained the heavy silence that followed Catherine's arrival. Because this wasn't just about inheritance, it was about memory. And memory, in the monarchy, can be more dangerous than power. The Queen's reaction was immediate, if restrained. Those close to her noted her abrupt shift in mood the moment she saw the sapphire gleam. Her conversation, once fluid, became clipped. Her eyes cold. She had spent years reordering the hierarchy, reinforcing her role beside the king. But the re-emergence of Diana's most personal jewel was a reminder that some shadows cannot be erased, only managed. And on that night, that shadow stood across from her, smiling politely, draped in a legacy she could never rewrite. To the outside world, it looked like elegance, but within those walls, it was read as rebellion. A gentle, poised, undeniable rebellion. Catherine's choice didn't need explanation. Its symbolism was thunderous. She had chosen not a crown, not a title, but a wound. A wound the monarchy never truly healed from. And in doing so, she aligned herself with more than a memory. She aligned herself with an unspoken warning that some stories will not stay buried, no matter how tightly the vault doors are shut. The fallout was instant. Within hours, the internet erupted. The choker that shouldn't be seen dominated headlines. Commentators, royal watchers, and former aides flooded media channels with speculation. Had Catherine broken protocol? Had William defied the king? Or was this the beginning of a subtle realignment of influence within the royal circle? The palace, true to form, said nothing. But silence has always been its loudest reply. And yet, Catherine wasn't the only one playing memory games with diamonds. Another row she's always been the steel spine of the monarchy. But Anne's choice that night left even royal watchers stunned. She wore a brooch last seen on Queen Mary during a secret pre-war summit. What did it mean? And why did she fix her gaze so directly on Camilla as she entered? Princess Anne has never sought spectacle. She doesn't wield power with flourish. She carries it like a burden, quietly, steadily, without need for applause. But on that particular night, she arrived with more than just her usual restraint. She came armed with history. Pinned high on her chest was a brooch no one had seen in generations, a dark, commanding piece with roots too complex for a press release. The Habsburg Cross, a relic tied not to coronations or weddings, but to a meeting never officially recorded, in a room never publicly acknowledged. It was 1937 when Queen Mary wore it last, during a clandestine gathering with German envoys, a moment laced with geopolitical tension and whispered regrets. Since then, the piece had vanished, until now. Its reappearance was no accident. Anne had chosen to remind the family, and perhaps the nation, of the monarchy's deeper shadows. She had always believed in duty above theatrics, but this gesture was different, deliberate. And the target of her message was unmistakable. The moment Camilla entered the hall, Anne's eyes followed her, not with anger, but with a calm, calculated steadiness. It was a look that acknowledged not just the present conflict, but the buried fractures beneath it. The kind of gaze that spoke in unfinished sentences and unsaid truths. Behind the scenes, tensions between Anne and Charles had quietly simmered for years, especially over the control of historic jewels. In 2006, following the Queen Mother's death, the two had reportedly sparred over several pieces designated for preservation rather than redistribution. Anne had pushed for vault security, insisting certain heirlooms remain untouched. Charles, guided by advisors and increasingly influenced by Camilla, argued for modernization and reallocation. What had once been a discussion turned into a standoff, one the Queen eventually resolved by entrusting several sensitive pieces directly to Anne's safekeeping, away from the reach of royal reclassification. The Habsburg cross had been one of them, and by wearing it that night, Anne wasn't simply making a statement, she was issuing a reminder that not all jewels exist to be flaunted. Some exist to bear witness, to anchor memory, and perhaps to hold others accountable. The discomfort among those present was palpable, even if unspoken. Staff reportedly noted a distinct shift in the room's energy once the brooch was recognized. Several senior courtiers looked away. Camilla, for a fleeting moment, went completely still. Anne said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence has always been her sharpest blade. In a family torn between modern facades and ancestral ghosts, she chose the latter. And she did so with precision. While others dressed to impress, Anne had dressed to remember, to confront, to hold a mirror to the lineage that had, too often, hidden behind crowns and ceremonies. But while Anne used memory, others used manipulation, and no one was more adept at that than the current queen herself. Yal had a deeper plan and a darker past to avenge. Camilla didn't need a crown to assert dominance. The necklace she wore wasn't just rare, it was practically forbidden. Last gifted by Edward VIII before his abdication, it had vanished into silence. Until now. Her message? She was rewriting the rules of power, and no one, not even ghosts, could stop her. For years, she had stood in the margins of royal acceptance, watched, scrutinized, tolerated, but never truly crowned in the court of public sentiment. And perhaps that's what made her move so precise. She didn't ask for approval, she claimed it. On a night already heavy with layered defiance, Camilla entered wearing what many believed had been permanently buried by time and shame: the abdication emeralds. A set of jewels so entangled in betrayal, exile, and scandal that even Queen Elizabeth II is said to have kept them in a private vault, never to be worn again. Not out of fear, but out of respect for a wound the monarchy had long tried to forget. And yet, there they were, gleaming around the neck of a woman who understood better than anyone what it meant to live outside the lines of royal expectation. No public documentation existed for the necklace's re-entry into the vault registry. In fact, even senior palace aides were caught off guard. Some reportedly pleaded with Camilla in the days leading up to the event, urging her to reconsider, to avoid reviving old ghosts. She didn't just ignore them. She smiled. A smile that would echo through the corridors for days after. It wasn't the smile of peace. It was the smile of a woman who had waited long enough to be told no. and who had finally decided that she would no longer ask. Throughout the night, her posture was unshaken, collected, icy. She made no effort to soften the statement she wore, because for Camilla, this was more than jewelry. It was punctuation, a full stop to the years of being spoken about in hushed tones, a declaration that she, not Catherine, not Anne, not even the memory of Diana, now held the center of gravity in the royal firmament. The Queen didn't have to say a word. She let the emeralds speak for her. But others noticed the fracture it created. Charles, in particular, appeared visibly strained. Observers noted the distance between them during official photographs, a slight stiffness in his stance, a lack of his usual hand gestures. Those close to the family described it as a silent recoil, the quiet recognition that his wife's boldness had pushed further than expected. Perhaps too far. Yet he said nothing. Because once the abdication emeralds were worn, there was no returning them to darkness. The message had already been delivered. And it wasn't just a message to the family. It was a challenge to every woman in the royal line who had once believed in tradition, obedience, and inherited place. Camilla had skipped the line. She had taken a set of jewels soaked in controversy and turned them into a new kind of crown. One not granted, but seized. Not given, but taken. And in doing so, she shattered a hierarchy built over generations. But some rules aren't broken with emeralds. They're broken in silence. And one woman, unseen for months, made her presence known without saying a word. She wasn't expected to attend. Some even believed she wouldn't be invited. But Sarah, Duchess of York, arrived late, and wearing a tiara no one could place. Vault officials later admitted the piece wasn't logged. So where had it come from? And what was she trying to say? In a family defined by silence and exclusion, Sarah Ferguson had become both legend and warning. Once embraced, then exiled, she had long existed in the periphery, visible but irrelevant, tolerated but never truly welcome. Her presence at the gathering was whispered about, but not confirmed, until the doors opened again halfway through the evening, and she walked in, alone, head held high, and on that head a tiara that didn't belong. Not to the vault, not to the registry, not even to the living memory of the royal staff. It was unfamiliar, delicate yet defiant, and within minutes, speculation spread like wildfire. Rumors erupted that the piece had once been designed for Diana, an unfinished commission, halted by her death, quietly forgotten before it could ever be completed. And if that was true, then its sudden appearance was more than unsettling. It was provocative. Vault officials, pressed for answers, could provide none. No record existed of its withdrawal, no note of restoration. And yet, the craftsmanship bore unmistakable markers of early 90s royal commissions, combined with details only someone intimately familiar with Diana's taste could have requested. The resemblance was uncanny and deeply uncomfortable. Some claimed the tiara had resurfaced through private channels, that Sarah, having long operated outside the rigid structures of the monarchy, had acquired it through backdoor routes, an auction, a collector, perhaps even a sympathetic staffer who remembered too much and said too little. The crown's appearance wasn't legal, but it was symbolic. A declaration from a woman who had once been cast out but never gave up her claim to relevance. Not through scandal this time, but through memory. What rattled the palace more than the jewel itself was what it represented. It was not just an ornament. It was a resurrection, a silent accusation, a reminder of promises broken and names erased. And it didn't take long for connections to be drawn to her daughter. Princess Beatrice had reportedly accessed the vaults under private escort just days before. The records were vague, the timing suspicious, and the nature of the visit unclear. But many believed she was the one who cleared the path, ensuring her mother's presence would not just be seen, but felt. Inside the room, the tension was thick. Conversations slowed. Eyes narrowed. For decades, Sarah had been the scandal, the outsider. But that night, she became something more dangerous. An uninvited truth. She wore that tiara not for beauty, not for defiance, but for reclamation. For all the times her name was spoken in hushed tones. For all the spaces where her image was quietly removed. Her message was sharp and unmissable. Some women returned not to ask for acceptance, but to remind the room they never truly left. And just as tension peaked inside the palace, something unexpected shattered the calm. From outside the gates. As the royals displayed centuries of power behind closed doors, a crowd gathered outside. But these weren't ordinary protesters. They held signs not of political anger, but of names. Names of women whose jewels were never returned, whose stories were erased. That night, their ghosts came knocking. The air outside the palace had shifted, hours before the gates closed and the vaults quietly opened for the evening's gathering. A different kind of procession had begun along the mall. Silent at first, but growing. A slow-moving line of faces, banners, and photographs that didn't demand change. They demanded recognition. These weren't activists armed with slogans. They were descendants. Descendants of forgotten queens, lost empresses, and nameless consorts whose jewels had crossed oceans under the guise of diplomacy, tribute, or conquest. Jewels that had disappeared into velvet-lined drawers, emerging only for ceremonies that spoke of continuity, but not of cost. One by one, they held up images, grainy portraits from colonial archives, annotated ledgers with names long removed from official histories. Jewelry once worn in Lahore, Lagos, Rangoon, Kingston, now locked away beneath London. The chants didn't mention revolution or reparations. They asked a different question. Where is her crown? It wasn't just a call for justice. It was an accusation, elegant and unignorable. The kind of accusation that even palace walls couldn't fully silence. Word spread fast, not from the gates, but from a leak. A former royal aide, still unnamed, had allegedly shared confidential details about the event with key organizers. The names of attendees, the timing, even hints of what might be worn. It was enough to mobilize the right voices, enough to bring the past crashing into the present. And once the first images reached social media, it exploded. The hashtag, The Forgotten Queens, trended globally within hours. Photographs of the protesters, standing shoulder to shoulder with images of disappeared royalty, circulated with captions that cut deep. If their jewels are remembered, why aren't their names? Inside, the mood shifted from uneasy to uncontainable. Windows were closed. Security tightened. Catherine and Camilla were both quietly advised to remain within the building for the remainder of the night. Not for safety, but to avoid the optics. The image of royal women in heirloom diamonds emerging into a crowd demanding answers about the very origin of those jewels was deemed too risky. The monarchy had weathered storms, but this was different. This wasn't scandal. It was exposure. And exposure, in a family built on curated mystery, is the one thing that cannot be permitted to grow. For 48 hours, the royal press office went silent. No response, no clarification, no denial. And in that silence, the pressure only mounted. Journalists who had once accepted protocol now asked pointed questions. Historians offered context the palace never wanted aired. The gap between myth and reality widened, not through violence, but through names. Names the monarchy had once buried beneath titles, now resurrected by voices outside the gates. But the real climax wasn't outside or inside. It happened later, in a room without cameras, where the Queen made her move. No photographers, no aides, just a locked room and 3 women who knew the stakes. Anne, Camilla, and Catherine sat at a table with one item between them: a revised succession list for the vault. That night, the monarchy's future wasn't debated. It was rewritten. What had begun as a private gathering had spiraled into a public reckoning. The press remained silent, but the silence was its own headline. Inside the palace, the atmosphere had curdled. The protest outside had rattled more than the gates. It had cracked the illusion of control. And in response, an emergency meeting was called, not with the king, not with the prime minister, but between the 3 women who now stood as the unofficial architects of the crown's future image. Each carried her own version of what the monarchy should be, and none of them intended to leave that room without having altered the path ahead. Anne, rooted in legacy, entered with the weight of centuries on her shoulders. She didn't argue. She reminded that the jewels weren't simply accessories, but archives, that each tiara, each brooch, was a link in a chain forged through blood, war, and coronation. And that to separate them from their history, to reassign or hide them, was not modernization, but erasure. She demanded adherence to the original protocols, to the Queen Mother's will, to the codes of inheritance that, while unspoken, had guided the monarchy through fire and frost. Camilla, measured and cold, countered with a different view. Her power wasn't built on inheritance, it was built on reinvention. She argued that discretion was now survival, that public sentiment was no longer a battlefield won by tradition, but by optics, by silence, by careful, strategic absence. She proposed a new structure: private control over vault access, fewer ceremonial appearances, more modernization with curated releases, no more unannounced tiaras, no more vault politics bleeding into public drama. In her vision, the jewels would become symbols again, but only under sanctioned terms. It was Catherine who refused the binary. She proposed a third path, a hybrid system, one that would neither erase history nor surrender it entirely to damage control. A vault council, comprised not solely of reigning figures, but of those who understood both legacy and perception. Beatrice's name was introduced, a nod, perhaps, to the role she had played in her mother's controversial appearance, a subtle signal that the future could not be written without acknowledging the sidelined. The argument grew tense, but it never broke into chaos. These women didn't raise voices. They made decisions, each word carved with calculation, each glance a negotiation. And when it ended, something rare happened. Agreement. A document was signed, its contents sealed, but sources close to the palace confirmed what the public would never see. A fundamental shift in who controlled the crown jewels, not just physically, but symbolically. And when morning came, they emerged. But the jewels were gone. All of them. Locked away once more. Except one. Of all the pieces worn that night, only one never returned to the vault. No one saw who took it. No one will say. But 3 weeks later, a small sapphire brooch appeared pinned to the coat of a royal staff member in a public crowd. Quiet, unnoticed. Except by those who knew. It wasn't part of any official record. It wasn't requested. It wasn't signed out. Yet it vanished. And not just any piece. This brooch, small and somber, had long been whispered about, but never confirmed. The Tears of Mary, a sapphire jewel traced to the early Tudor queens. Past, lost, recovered, hidden. Its story was stitched into the silent corridors of the monarchy like a thread no one dared pull. Said to be worn only in mourning, it carried with it the legacy of women who were never crowned, but shaped the throne all the same. It hadn't surfaced publicly in over a century. Most believed it was buried deep in the vaults, too emotionally weighted to be displayed, too intimate to be claimed. And yet, it returned. But not where anyone expected. It wasn't spotted at a state event. It wasn't pinned to a duchess or draped over protocol. It appeared on the coat of a longtime palace assistant, someone rarely photographed, often overlooked. She had been seen walking beside Catherine during a charity engagement, blending into the background as usual. But there it was, subtle, soft, worn without fanfare, just a sapphire glint in the cold light. At first, no one noticed, but those who recognized it didn't speak. They simply stopped, paused, because they understood what it meant, and more importantly, who it was meant for. Theories erupted. Some said Catherine had orchestrated it herself, making sure the brooch escaped without drawing royal attention, placing it in the hands of someone loyal, someone invisible. Others believed it was an act of defiance from within, a quiet rebellion against the final decision made behind that locked door, a refusal to let every symbol of grief and legacy be boxed away again. And some whispered it had simply slipped through, passed hand to hand in the final hours, without trace, without record, without permission. An internal investigation was quietly launched, but yielded no outcome, or at least none that was ever shared. Security protocols were reportedly reviewed. The staff member in question was not dismissed. No statement was issued. Not a single official word addressed the brooch's public appearance. And that, perhaps, said everything. Because this wasn't about theft. It was about inheritance, not of blood, but of meaning. The Tears of Mary had always been about those who mourn in silence, the women who bore crowns without ceremony, who lost sons, titles, names, yet remained. Its sudden, quiet reappearance wasn't a breach. It was a reminder that not all jewels belong in vaults. Some belong in plain sight, on the shoulders of those who remember what others have forgotten, not as spectacle, but as truth. Some stories are told in words, others in silence. And then there are those that shimmer quietly in the night, never forgotten, never claimed.